imagine, and I think that a lot of the fantasies that I hear in my practice is just a desire to be wanted by somebody and not have expectations thrown on them and not feel that they're not measuring up in some way. And the fantasy that, in spite of, for example, in a massage parlor, in spite of the fact that these women see dozens of people a day, that somehow they're going to walk in and be the special person.
Right. Did you see that Jack Nicholson movie, like Carnal Knowledge?
Oh,
no. I guess you could say it's probably like it's a famous movie written by Jules Feiffer. It came out in 1971. Takes Jack from high school, and he's just constantly pursuing women. And he tells his best friend, "Oh, if I could only have met someone whose butt was like an inch smaller and her legs were like an inch longer, or like then I could have gotten married." And then he ends up in the final scene with a paid prostitute, and he has this whole scenario that he has to work out for him to get aroused. And so she has to tell him, "Oh, you're so this, and you're so this, and you're this." And then she gets one thing wrong, and he just explodes with anger at her. "No, you have to do it like this." And I think it sounds so classic.
Well, the important thing too is when people act out with say a prostitute, they are objectifying that person, and since they don't know each other as human beings, he or she can be anyone he or she wants to.
Yeah.
The prostitute becomes whoever they want them to be. Also, it is fantasy. It is basically acting and role playing. But the unfortunate thing is, part of the fantasy feels like it could be. There's some feeling of reality to it. There's a delusional quality to it, and it's pretty sad because the way people act out generally points to the trauma that they experience that they're trying to triumph over, that they're reenacting a trauma of some kind that they want to triumph over. In other words, if they're exploiting people, I would assume they were exploited in some way. If they're betraying someone, they were betrayed in some way. If they want to feel absolutely adored and wanted, there's somebody at home that they're not adoring and wanting either. And they may have not felt wanted. They may have felt neglected or invisible, or something happened. I don't think it's abnormal for someone to lust or to look at other women, or a woman to look at other men and lust. God knows I'm guilty, but how we act on it and how we make decisions in terms of our best interest with that, I think is key in whether it becomes a problem or not, or if we even feel like we have any control over what we do with it. I don't think a sex addict really has control over how they react to something. There's a spontaneous situation that comes up for them that they feel they have to go and carry out. Most of the addiction is ritual. If you look at all the hours spent that a person goes through grooming, getting themselves ready, thinking about, fantasizing about, going online, finding this, finding that, looking for the right thing, on and on and on, when they actually are acting out, we're talking about how long is the actual acting out. It's not that long. Half hour? An hour? I mean, it's not. The orgasm is how long? The amount of time spent in ritual and fantasy is way more than the actual acting out portion of it. And then there's the cycle of remorse that comes from it. And guess what? We have to go back into fantasy again to get away from that. So I don't think they have that much fun acting out. I can't imagine it to be a very pleasant experience for most of the time.
So what's the consensus in your profession about sex addiction being an addiction like alcohol addiction?
Well, my colleagues tend to call it sex addiction, so I assume that the consensus is there's a similarity. I do think, alcoholism also can be considered an intimacy disorder because you're not really present when you're drinking.
Yeah.
You're not connected with yourself, you're not connected with other people, or that's the only way you can connect. So again, any addiction takes a person away from realities to some extent. Whether it's gambling or sex addiction, there's also a biological component in which a person does get hooked on their own chemicals. When you see a gambler looking at a little screen with horses, you see the adrenaline, I mean, their jugular pumping.
Right.
I mean, they have this glazed look. They're in a bubble. That's
Right.
what they call it for the sex addicts, too. And when you see a sex addict that is totally in their trance, so to speak, or bubble, you can see that glazed look in their eyes, and they're not really there. It's impenetrable. You can't get through.
So many of the people we're talking about with these type of addictions are living in a fantasy world because they prefer to spend time there than to make the concrete changes in the real world to lead a better life.
I wouldn't say they prefer it. That's how they've learned how to cope.
Yeah.
That's how they've learned to shield themselves from the pain of growing up, the pain of rejection, the pain of having to look at themselves critically. You know, when you're in a partnership with someone, you're going to get criticized.
Yeah.
You know, it's part of being in a relationship, but a sex addict may hear as a criticism like, why don't you pick up the socks, as she doesn't like me.
Yeah.
They hear it as something completely
Yeah.
different. And they provoke a person also into becoming the person they claim they don't want.
Yeah.
And this allows them to act out again. This is justification to act out.
What percentage of the population would you estimate is an addict?
That's a hard one to say too, because I don't do censuses for
I know,
and
but just
I don't know how honest.
from your
But I
encounter with life.
my encounter is what comes in my office, so
Yeah.
that would be 100%.
But what about the regular, as you know people well? In the real world?
I think everyone has problems.
Yeah.
And whether it's an addictive problem or a compulsive problem or just a coping mechanism that isn't necessarily the best one, I think we all have them.
Yeah.
And the reason why there's laws is because inherently we don't have rules. You know, laws are made so people can learn how to live with each other without hurting each other or themselves. So that shows that even as adults, there has to be something in place that isn't inherent in us. We forget we are animals, and at least that's my point of view, is that just because we have a higher level of intelligence and have thumbs and we can have conversations with each other and think things through, we still have a reactivity mechanism, we have survival mechanisms that isn't too different from animals. And although we are separate from them, we don't always give that credit. So I think people will do just about anything if there's no consequences involved.
What are your thoughts on that syndrome that you outlined earlier, where the detectives find that when they're hired by a wife to check up on a husband to see if he's cheating around, she rarely divorces, but if they go the other way around, if it's a husband who's hiring them to check up on a wife, they usually divorce. What do you think are some of the things that are going on there?
Well, two things. It may be that a man can't tolerate the idea of a woman being unfaithful.
Yeah.
It may be that a man feels that he has other options. There's other women out there that would go out with him.
Mm-hmm.
It may be that he has good boundaries. You know, this is not what we planned on. This is not what we agreed to. You broke your promise. I'm out of here. There's several things at play. For a woman, quite often, they feel that they don't have options. They may be financially